Most people imagine bankruptcy as something loud: courtrooms, headlines, public disgrace, a sudden fall that everyone notices at once. But that image applies almost exclusively to the middle class and the poor. When wealthy people collapse, it happens differently: quieter, cleaner, almost invisible. And that silence is not accidental, it is engineered. For the rich, bankruptcy is rarely a moment, it is a process, a long, controlled unwinding that happens behind closed doors, shielded by lawyers, private agreements, and the complexity of their own financial structures. There are no eviction notices taped to glass doors, no public auctions with photographers waiting. What exists instead is distance, time, and layers. Wealth does not disappear overnight, it dissolves. The first reason elite bankruptcies go unnoticed is fragmentation. Rich people do not own things directly. They own them through entities, trusts, holding companies, partnerships, offshore vehicles. When one structure fails, it doesn't look like a collapse. It looks like a reorganization. An asset moves, a company is dissolved, a liability is restructured. From the outside, nothing seems wrong. The car is still there, the house lights are still on, the lifestyle appears intact. What the public doesn't see is that each layer absorbs damage quietly. Losses are contained, negotiated, deferred. Payments are missed, but only after being renegotiated 3 times. Creditors are not angry, they are patient because patience is cheaper than panic when dealing with high net worth individuals. Another reason the collapse is silent is access. Wealthy people don't deal with automated systems. They don't receive final notices generated by software. They deal with humans, relationship managers, private bankers, attorneys who return calls immediately. Problems are handled before they become visible. When a rich person cannot pay, the conversation doesn't begin with, "You're late." It begins with, "How do we manage this?" Time is extended, terms are softened, deadlines move, the system bends, not because it is kind, but because it is rational. Recovering something slowly is better than forcing a public failure that destroys value. Then there is the most misunderstood element of elite bankruptcy: optics. Wealthy people understand that visibility is leverage. As long as they look stable, they retain negotiating power. The moment instability becomes public, leverage disappears. So everything is done to preserve the image of normalcy. They still attend events, still travel, still appear calm, not because they are fine, but because appearing fine is part of the strategy. Panic is expensive, silence is cheap. There is also shame, but not the kind people expect. Among the wealthy, failure is not embarrassing because of money. It is embarrassing because of competence. Running out of money suggests miscalculation, not misfortune. That is why elite bankruptcies are hidden, not from the public, but from peers. Friends disappear quietly, invitations slow down, conversations become shorter. Not because anyone says anything, but because everyone understands. Financial trouble in elite circles is contagious. No one wants to be the person who lent money right before the collapse, and so the rich fail alone. What makes this even harder to detect is that elite bankruptcy often doesn't end with zero. It ends with less, much less. A smaller house instead of a mansion, one property instead of 5, commercial flights instead of private jets. From the outside, it still looks like wealth. From the inside, it feels like loss. The lifestyle contracts, not collapses. This is why people are shocked years later when they learn someone lost everything. In reality, everything was lost slowly, piece by piece, while the illusion was carefully maintained. By the time the truth becomes visible, the story is already over. And this silence serves a final purpose: protection of identity. Because for the wealthy, money is not just currency, it is proof of who they are. Losing it publicly would mean rewriting their entire self-image. Quiet failure allows them to grieve without witnesses. The most dangerous stage of elite bankruptcy is not the loss of money itself. It is the moment when strategy turns into denial, when the silence that once protected begins to conceal rot. This is where wealthy people don't just lose assets, they lose control. At first, silence is intentional. It buys time. It allows restructuring. But over time, that same silence becomes a mirror the person refuses to look into. Numbers are delayed, reports are skimmed instead of read, advisors are filtered through ego, bad news is softened before it reaches the top, and the wealthy, insulated by layers of privilege, begin to believe the illusion they originally created for others. This is the phase where lifestyle inflation becomes fatal. Because even as income shrinks, expenses don't adjust. Staff remains, security stays, properties are maintained just in case. The logic sounds reasonable. Sell later, recover later, fix it when the next deal comes through. But later is expensive, and hope is not a financial plan. At this level, cutting costs feels like humiliation. Downsizing is interpreted not as prudence, but as surrender. So instead of reducing exposure, the wealthy double down. They borrow against future income. They refinance assets already under strain. They accept advances on projects that haven't been built yet. Every move pushes risk forward in time, turning tomorrow into a dumping ground for today's mistakes. This is where elite bankruptcy begins to smell, not to the public, but to insiders. Banks notice first, not because payments are missed, but because patterns change. Requests become more frequent, explanations grow longer, the tone shifts from confidence to justification. Credit lines remain open, but the margins tighten. Interest increases quietly. Covenants are added where none existed before. Then the advisors begin to reposition themselves. Lawyers ask for retainers instead of deferring fees. Accountants insist on stricter documentation. Consultants reduce scope. Everyone involved senses that the relationship may end badly, and they want insulation. What the wealthy person experiences at this stage is not panic, but confusion. They feel surrounded by professionals, yet increasingly alone. No one says the words, "You're in trouble." Everyone says, "We'll see." And that ambiguity is lethal. At the same time, the social circle continues to contract. This is not abandonment in the dramatic sense. It is recalibration. Dinners are postponed, collaborations are delayed. People stop asking for favors and stop offering them. The flow of informal opportunity dries up. The wealthy often misinterpret this as bad timing or external hostility. In reality, it is risk management. Social capital behaves like financial capital. It withdraws from unstable positions, and still the illusion holds. The house is still owned, the cars are still driven, the travel continues. From the outside, nothing appears broken, but internally, liquidity is vanishing. Every unexpected expense becomes a negotiation. Every delay adds pressure. This is the moment when silence stops protecting and starts isolating, because problems that are never spoken eventually lose the chance to be solved. The tragedy of elite bankruptcy is that help often still exists at this stage, but only if the person is willing to shrink before being forced to admit vulnerability before it becomes visible, to sacrifice status to preserve autonomy. Most don't. They wait for a rescue that never comes, a deal that falls through, a market that doesn't rebound, and by the time the silence breaks, it does so violently, not with headlines, but with legal action. When elite bankruptcy reaches its final phase, it stops being personal and becomes procedural. This is the point where silence no longer protects because the system itself begins to speak. And systems speak in documents, deadlines, and irreversible actions. What changes first is tone. Communications that were once flexible become formal. Conversations move from phone calls to emails, from emails to letters. Words like understanding and temporary quietly disappear, replaced by obligation, compliance, and material breach. Nothing dramatic happens all at once, but everything becomes colder. At this stage, institutions take over. Banks escalate files internally. Legal departments replace relationship managers. Decisions are no longer influenced by familiarity or history. They are made by committees that have never met the person behind the account. To them, reputation is irrelevant. Only exposure matters. This is where the wealthy often experience genuine shock for the first time, not because the numbers suddenly worsened, but because the human buffer is gone. The system no longer negotiates emotionally, it executes. Assets that were once strategic are now non-essential. Properties once described as legacy holdings are reclassified as liabilities. Lines of credit are frozen, not out of hostility, but out of protocol. The language becomes final even when it remains polite, and still much of this happens out of public view. Elite bankruptcy does not announce itself with sirens. It announces itself with silence followed by paperwork. By the time the outside world notices anything, the internal outcome has already been decided. This is also the phase where forced choices replace preferences. Selling is no longer about timing the market, it is about satisfying conditions. Downsizing is no longer strategic humility, it is mandatory compliance. Control is lost not because someone took it, but because it was surrendered gradually through avoidance. For many wealthy individuals, this moment carries a particular psychological weight. They are not afraid of being poor, they are afraid of being ordinary, of losing the identity built around access, influence, and exception. That fear keeps them clinging to symbols long after the substance has gone. But institutions do not care about symbols. Once the process reaches this point, outcomes narrow quickly. Either assets are liquidated under controlled conditions or they are seized under uncontrolled ones. The difference between those two paths is not money, it is timing. The cruel irony is that elite bankruptcy is often survivable if confronted early. Quiet restructuring can preserve autonomy. Strategic retreat can protect dignity. But denial transforms manageable decline into irreversible loss. And when the final agreements are signed, when the last asset changes hands, there is no moment of collapse, no dramatic ending, just a strange calm, a realization that the fight was over long before the outcome became visible. Elite bankruptcy repeats itself because the system that creates wealth also teaches avoidance. The very traits that allow people to rise, confidence, risk tolerance, narrative control, become liabilities when circumstances change. Silence feels like strength, admission feels like weakness, and so the instinct is always the same: manage perception first, reality later. For the wealthy, truth is dangerous not because it is painful, but because it collapses optionality. The moment trouble is acknowledged openly, choices disappear. Credit tightens, social distance increases, negotiating power evaporates. Silence, by contrast, preserves flexibility, or at least it appears to. This is why elite failure hides behind complexity. Structures multiply not only for tax efficiency, but for emotional insulation. Each layer creates distance between the person and the consequence. When something goes wrong, it happens in the company, in the trust, in the partnership. The individual remains untouched until suddenly they aren't. Another reason silence persists is cultural. In high status environments, success is assumed to be permanent. Decline is treated as a moral flaw, not a circumstance. To admit trouble is to signal incompetence, and incompetence in elite circles is far more damaging than loss itself. So people wait. They wait for markets to turn, for deals to close, for attention to return, for something external to justify recovery without requiring internal change. This waiting is framed as patience, but it is often paralysis. What makes elite bankruptcy so misunderstood is that the end state still looks comfortable. The person does not end up homeless. They are not publicly ruined. They simply become smaller than they were, less visible, less influential. And because comparison is the true currency of status, that reduction feels catastrophic, even if it would look like abundance to anyone else. The tragedy is not the loss of money, it is the loss of adaptability. Those who survive elite bankruptcy psychologically are not the ones who protect their image longest. They are the ones who abandon it earliest, who accept contraction as strategy, not defeat, who trade spectacle for stability before the trade is forced upon them. But this requires a rare skill, the ability to separate identity from scale. Most cannot. They confuse who they are with how large their life has become. And so they fight to preserve size long after it has stopped serving them. They protect symbols instead of systems. They defend narratives instead of numbers. Silence in that context becomes self-destructive. What began as protection turns into isolation. Advisors stop warning, friends stop asking, the feedback loop collapses, and by the time reality speaks loudly enough to be heard, it speaks in commands, not suggestions. Elite bankruptcy is quiet because it is designed to be. But it is also quiet because those inside it are afraid to make noise, afraid that if they speak honestly, everything will fall apart. They don't realize it already has. Elite bankruptcy is not a financial failure in the way most people understand it. It is an identity failure disguised as accounting. Money is only the surface. What actually collapses is the story a person tells themselves about who they are and why the rules should continue to bend for them. For the wealthy, money has never been just utility. It has been insulation, proof of relevance, a buffer between choice and consequence. When that buffer thins, the fear isn't about survival, it's about exposure, about being seen without the armor that once guaranteed deference. That is why elite bankruptcy feels so lonely. Not because people disappear out of cruelty, but because the social contract changes. When someone no longer represents opportunity, protection fades. When access disappears, attention follows. This isn't betrayal, it's gravity. What remains after the unwind is often something the wealthy were never trained to face: limits. Limits on spending, limits on influence, limits on how much reality can be postponed. And limits for people accustomed to exception feel like punishment. Yet paradoxically, this is also the point where freedom can return. Those who survive elite bankruptcy with their sanity intact are not the ones who claw back status at any cost. They are the ones who accept reduction without humiliation, who stop performing stability and start rebuilding it, quietly, on a scale that matches reality, not memory. This requires abandoning a dangerous illusion that visibility equals power. In truth, visibility is fragile. It demands constant feeding, constant proof, constant escalation. Real power is the ability to endure without an audience. Elite bankruptcy exposes how few people actually possess that power. The reason these collapses remain invisible is not because they are rare, but because they are inconvenient to acknowledge. Society prefers the myth of permanent success. It prefers heroes who fall spectacularly or not at all. Quiet decline disrupts that narrative. It suggests that failure is often gradual, rational, and self inflicted, and that makes it uncomfortable. In the end, the wealthy do not lose everything. They lose excess. They lose illusion. They lose the luxury of avoiding truth. What they gain, if they are willing, is something far more valuable than status: alignment. Alignment between income and life, between identity and reality, between ambition and capacity. Most never reach it. They chase restoration instead of recalibration. They rebuild the same structure on a smaller foundation and repeat the cycle. But a few learn the lesson elite bankruptcy offers without mercy. Silence can hide failure, but it cannot reverse it. Scale can impress others, but it cannot protect you. And wealth that cannot survive honesty was never security to begin with. That is why the rich go bankrupt quietly, and why, if they are wise, they start over even quieter.